back live with you. I hope that you can see and hear me okay now. We've had some issues with our Wi-Fi and things like that, but we are doing well now. Set that out of the way. And we're in Romans 6 at verse 20. Last week's message helped us cover the first part of that, so we're going to move on from there. But I want to recap a little bit of last week's discussion, because this chapter is not one of those that is easy to understand. Last week we talked about that it says God prepared some for condemnation, if you will, or destruction, and some for blessing. And we argue with that, saying, well, that's not right. And how does God harden hearts? And He wants everybody to come to repentance. We talked through that last week, and basically the gist of it is that God creates everybody for Himself. He wants nobody to be rejected. But there are some people who resist God, and God uses that resistance when He breaks that person to recognize that they're not God, because that's what a hard heart is, a heart that thinks that God isn't God and that maybe they are. And so when He said about Pharaoh that the very purpose he was raised up was that God might show His power in him and that His name would be declared in all the earth. Well, Pharaoh's heart was hardened. And then when his heart broke with the loss of his son, he let the people go in his grief. And so it looked like maybe he finally realized he's not God. But at the same time, a few days after he released them, he went after them because his heart hardened again. Now you might say, well then, why does heart harden? Did God do that? And the answer is that Pharaoh hardened himself against God. Because someone who doesn't believe in God, their heart's going to be hardened against God. And that's how God hardens a heart. And you'll find a lot of people who don't believe in God, their heart remains hard toward God because they don't believe in it. They don't think that God is anything that they want to deal with. And then some people say, well then, if He has mercy on who He has mercy and hardens who He hardens, then what's it matter? What can we say then? How can God find fault in someone whose heart He made to be hardened? And again, it doesn't say God made his heart to be hardened. It's they hardened their heart against God, and that was how they were predisposed once their heart was hard. You see, Pharaoh wasn't given over to a society that believed God was anything other than the Pharaoh. And when Pharaoh was God, in his own mind, he believed that he was eternal and had all the power. When the power was stripped from him and he wasn't, and he realized he was less powerful than the Israelite God, he didn't want him around anymore. And so he sent him packing, hardened against God, but not in a sense that he was happy for the Israelites to leave. He was just wanting the misery to go away and the pain. And then in that act of pain, he sent them away. But he realized as a few days went by that he probably said to himself, what have I done? What have I done? I've set these people free. And who's going to build my palaces and work for me? And they've taken everything that we own. What did I do? And he thought about all the things that he had given up in that moment and wanted it back, that he might restore the things that were there before. And he did it in anger. And anger usually doesn't accomplish a heart for God. And so that hardened his heart, and it was against God. And so in other words, God hardened his heart because of his relationship with God that didn't exist. But God didn't just reach in there and go, I'm going to make you hard against me. So in verse 19 it says, why does he still find fault, or who has resisted his will? And in 20 it says, indeed, O man, who are you to reply against God? Will the thing formed say to him who formed it, why have you made me like this? You see, throughout this chapter, we are beginning to deal with our humanistic side of reasoning, versus God's perspective on things. Throughout this chapter, we say fair and unfair would be a human way of saying what God's doing here. And this isn't fair, and that isn't fair, and this isn't just, and that isn't just. But is it not true that if God made it, he can do with it what he wants to with it? It seems that way. In verse 21, he makes it very clear. Doesn't the potter have power over the clay from the same lump to make one vessel for honor and another for dishonor? Isn't that what he says? And so that's how it works. That the one who's creating something doesn't make a vessel that he says is going to be bad and this one good, and then I'm going to remake this one. He loves them both. And one that he makes is made and it's set up to have a hard heart because of the way it's going to be raised or used or set in service. Think of it like this. If you had two different people who had the same kind of equipment, maybe offering plates, candles, and these different things, and one of them sanctified them for the use of God and said, this is going to be for God, those things will be for honor. Someone else took them and said, well, I'm just going to use these candles to light up my garage, and I'm going to put these plates here and put tools in them. And those aren't sanctified for God, but they're the same vessel made. So each thing is determined by honor and dishonor, not by the Creator, but by who puts it into use. And so the environment that it's put into largely determines its usage in the kingdom of God. And so he didn't say this offering plate and this candle was good and this one was bad. He made them both equally well. God does all things well. Yet one was used for simple menial tasks and one was used to glorify God. So one for honor, one for dishonor. So in verse 22, what if God, wanting to show his wrath and to make his power known, endured with much long-suffering the vessels of wrath prepared for destruction? Now, prepared does not mean that God prepared them necessarily ahead of time, but that God created them in such a way that they would put in an environment where they would end up being dishonorable or used for ungodly purposes and prepared by God for that purpose. I always struggle with this Old Testament stuff where God wipes out entire nations and purifies the land for his people. You know, you think about that. All the people that he drove out before the Israelites entered into the promised land, he told them, kill them all. Women, children, men, all of them. Kill them. And you think, wait a minute, why do you do that? That isn't very nice. That isn't very fair. But God was trying to set up his people into their place, and the other people didn't honor God. They had other gods, and they did not turn to him and call on the name of the Israelite God. Although they knew he existed, they were afraid of him, but they did not want to serve him. So God didn't make a choice to say, I'm going to destroy you because you're created for destruction. I put you in a place where you would have to choose me, and you did not. And to me, that almost seems like they were set up for failure, but God didn't set them up for failure. That's our perspective. God set them up to show his power. And we want to argue with God and say, but that isn't fair. That isn't right. But what God's trying to do is bestow glory on the vessels of the people that belong to him, to show his power to us. That the riches of his glory in verse 23 would be known on the vessels of mercy, which he's prepared beforehand for glory. In other words, that he has prepared a way for us to find his glory, to be a part of him in glory. He prepared that way beforehand. And he wants to put his mercy on us and his grace and the riches of his glory on us. Now, if he does that in such a way that other people who are hard-hearted, don't believe in God, resist God, use things for their propaganda rather than the kingdom, if those folks don't get to know God, it's tragic. And God grieves that they don't choose him. But at the same time, he's not going to allow them to have the blessings that he's had for those who receive his Son, and that grace that he has prepared for all who will come to him and call on his name. There are people who don't believe that they need God. There are people who believe that salvation is something that God's going to give everybody, or else other people believe it's no such thing. That there's reincarnation, or there's this life and nothing else, or there's karma. There's all sorts of different reasons. And some people believe that you just live and die, and that's it. But God prepared certain things for those who were going to belong to him and love him. And he says in verse 24, even us whom he called, not just the Jews, but also of the Gentiles. So don't you see that God did that? And what if he wanted to make his wrath, show his wrath, and to make his power known, that there are certain people among the Israelite nation that were not going to be a part of his kingdom because they did not receive God as God. They set themselves up for rejection. Because, as we said last week, all the people who belong to God are through the promise of Isaac and through his seed, which is Jesus Christ. We learn about that in Galatians if you want to do some further studying on that. In verse 25, he quotes Hosea, I will call them my people who were not my people. That's the Gentiles, those who are not the Jewish people of the time or of this time. And her beloved who was not beloved. In other words, God has selected some people who were not included in the Jewish nation. And that's the Gentiles, that's us. We get a part of this. And now the Jewish folks might be saying, well, that's not fair that he's bringing them in. This is ours. But it's ours too by faith. By the faith that we put into the promise that God made to Abraham through Isaac, through his seed, Jesus Christ. This promise is given to all people, but there are some people who still claim that Abraham is their father, and because of birthright, not faith right, but birthright, that they belong to God. But God has chosen that those who have faith in what he says would be a part of who he is in his kingdom. And so those who were at one time not a part of the lineage of Abraham are now accepted in by the promise of faith. And it shall come to pass in verse 26, the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they shall be called sons of the living God. The ones who were cast out before, away from the Israelites in their wilderness wanderings and preparing to enter the promised land, all those he destroyed, those were not his people. But he has now included all who will come by faith and made all his people. Isaiah cries out in verse 27, though the number of the children of Israel be as the sand of the sea, the remnant will be saved. The remnant. Not the entirety, but the remnant will be saved. For he will finish the work and cut it short in righteousness, because the Lord will make a short work upon the earth. God is going to save the remnant who did not bow to any other idol or God out of the Israelite nation, and he will bring that remnant in. And it seems almost like a total reversal of God's promise. When he said, you will be a great nation, numbered as the sands of the shore and the stars in the sky, he made that promise to Abram. And Abram believed it, and God credited to him his faith, which as righteous faith. And so when we see this happening, we think, well, that means all the Israelite nation. But again, the promise was through Isaac and his seed of Jesus Christ. And that number will be that many. But all the people who adhered to the promises being for a nation rather than a faith people are now seeing themselves as no longer included in the promise they thought was for them. And so they're upset, if you will. As Jesus says later, there'd be weeping and gnashing of teeth because he didn't know them and they didn't know him. But there's a remnant of them that will be there. And as the Lord in Isaiah said, unless the Lord of the Sabbath had left us a seed, this is verse 29, there's the seed again, we'd have become like Sodom and would have been made like Gomorrah. This is the nation of Israel they're talking about, that he's talking about, Isaiah's talking about. Unless there was a seed of faith left, all the people would have been left to destruction, and there would be nobody for God. But the seed of Jesus Christ made a way for even those who did not believe, yet were part of the Israelite nation, to have faith and be a part. So verse 30, what shall we say then? That Gentiles who do not pursue righteousness, that's us, we did not pursue righteousness, have attained to righteousness, the righteousness of faith. That we have attained to that because God made a way through his promise for us. And Israel, pursuing through the law, because the law was given to that nation, pursued righteousness that way, did not attain to the law of righteousness. Obviously in the law, anybody's going to sin. Everybody's going to make mistakes. And therefore, anybody who does is unrighteous, and the law precludes everybody to be stuck in sin. Because if you break one of the laws, even a small one, the whole entirety of the law is no longer valid as being keepable for you. Because you're 100% righteous, or you're not righteous at all. Righteous is 100% or none. So if you break a small sin, even something as simple as doing work on the Sabbath, one time in your life, you've broken the law and you're no longer righteous, because the law can't make you righteous. The law can only show you whether or not you have sinned. And so they pursued that righteousness by law, but they could not attain righteousness because the law couldn't make them righteous. It could only show them their unrighteousness. Why is this? In verse 32, because they did not seek righteousness by faith, and therefore they did not attain to the law of righteousness. Had they chosen to seek out righteousness through faith in God's help, in his directive, then they would have kept the law, and they would have also received the promises of his Son, and would have seen the righteous promise of the law through the seed. But because they didn't seek it by faith, as it were, but by works, in verse 32, they stumbled at that stumbling stone. And this is the key right here for Paul's whole argument, that if they don't receive Jesus, and the law didn't see Jesus in it, and rejected him, yet knew the law, they didn't understand the law, because the law was to lead them to Christ. It was a tutor, if you will, to lead them to Christ. If they didn't see Christ in it, then they didn't have faith by what the law said, because the law clearly proclaimed and revealed Christ as Messiah, but they will not and do not receive that. And therefore, they are stuck and stumbled at the stumbling stone. And this is how chapter 9 closes with verse 33. It says, "Behold, I lay in Zion a stumbling stone and a rock of offense." This is Jesus. "And whoever believes on him will not be put to shame." Faith is what's required for a relationship with Jesus Christ. Without it, we come to nothing, we have nothing. But with him, all things are possible. So what's that tell us? What is he saying in chapter 9? That without faith, there is no righteousness. Without faith, there is no pleasing God. Without faith, we set ourselves up to have a hard heart and a hardened heart against God. God set it up that if you're not a person of faith, that your heart will be hardened against him. And so we need to look at our lives and our hearts and see if we truly believe who God is and what he said. That we truly accept his promises and what he says to us. This is something that we need to understand is true for us. If our heart does not condemn us, but we truly believe Jesus Christ came to us to redeem us, to set us free, and that without him we come to nothing, but in him we can be truly righteous by faith alone, the gift of righteousness by faith in Christ, then we walk with him, we live with him, we live for him, and we walk out those promises. Otherwise, we also have our hearts that have been prepared for hardness against God. And the only way to break a hardened heart is to come broken before him and say, Lord, I need you. I need your redemption. I need your healing, your restoration. For without you, I can do nothing. This may be a difficult confession to make, but I've got to tell you something. In John chapter 15, Jesus says this, without the Father, I can do nothing. If Jesus said it, and he's the Son of God, how much more appropriate and applicable to us does that make it? That's chapter 9. Next time we get together in the evening, we'll be on chapter 10. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for being a part of this. If you have any comments or questions, maybe we can get together next time, and I'll be able to address some of those then. Until then, look through chapter 10 and go back through 9 and see what you think. See if we missed some things or some more things we need to talk about, and we'll do that next time. God bless you.